It's 4 o'clock on a Monday, and you know what that means, don't you? It's time for another exciting episode of Taxi TV Live. Yeah, baby. And today we are being joined by a very dear friend of mine, Biagio Messina. Welcome, Biagio.
Hey! Oh wow! This is like a dream come true. I just got the applause.
Yeah, you did.
Thanks for having me, Michael. By the way, I'm not gonna lie. I'm excited and nervous. This is kind of awesome, dudes. Thanks for having me.
I don't know why you're nervous. Let me read everybody your bio just so that, you know, a little, and then we'll get into the stuff that everybody's waiting for, which is how to make $1 million doing instrumental cues. Anyway, Biagio is one half of Joke Productions, which he runs with his lovely, talented, and incredibly smart wife, Joke. And yes, that's her real name, is Joke. She's from Belgium. Biagio is and has been a Taxi member for a number of years, and he's more than what the industry would call a triple threat. Actually, I think he's a quintuple threat. He's an actor, a writer, an executive producer / showrunner, an editor, and a musician / composer. A lot of slashes in there. Oh, and I forgot, he also directs. I don't know what you do. I don't know what comes after quintuple. Septuple, maybe?
I don't know. I think it's just overall nerd, overall tinkerer, you know? Or overall the budget's so low I have to do everything. So, you know, it just works out that way.
There you go. Oh, let's see. So anyway, he and Joke have become cherished friends of mine over the last 18 months or so. He's going to give you some real inside baseball about how music actually works in media today from the perspective of all of those roles that he plays. And if it's anything like the excellent presentation that he did at the 2023 Road Rally, you guys are in for a serious treat today. And if I may be so bold to say to you guys in the chat room, if maybe you could hold the chit-chat down a little bit today. People in the chat room love to talk about what they're making for dinner or what they're drinking at the time. You guys are going to want to hear every word of this, and you're going to want to take notes. So bust out your iPad or a notepad and a pencil, paper, whatever, and be prepared to take some notes for this. But before we jump into the meat of the episode, I want to share Biagio's bio with you so you know how fortunate we are to hear his perspectives today. Biagio Messina is known for the hit documentary Dying to Do Letterman, which I saw years before I ever met Biagio. CNN's Unmasking a Killer, which was a hit, and it's notable that the Golden State Killer, Rex Heuermann, is that how you say his name?
Actually, Rex Heuermann is the other serial killer we were covering who got caught. He's the Long Island serial killer.
Oh, that's what I was thinking. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Golden State is which guy?
Joseph James D'Angelo.
That's right.
So,
okay. I got him confused.
Of course, we didn't know that when we were making the show. They caught him, I think it was 9 or 10 days after we finished airing, which was pretty cool.
Wow. And they just charged Rex Heuermann with another murder, I think, yesterday. I saw, like, victim number 10. So you guys get to have a lot of fun at work. And their brand new hit series, Operation Undercover, which is now streaming on HBO Max. Biagio has been married to Joke. I butcher her name sometimes because she's from Belgium and they talk funny. Joke Fincioen.
Yeah, rhymes with balloon. You hit it.
Fincioen, I got it. All right.
With balloon. That's how you remember, yeah.
They've been married since 2001. Biagio was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and he grew up around the blue-collar suburb of Parma, Ohio. The mixing pot of ethnicities and personalities inspired him to tell stories. He wrote about his world He wrote about his world and began winning creative writing contests in grade school. Teachers encouraged him to pursue writing, directing, acting, and music. Boy, did you have good teachers. My teachers are like, shut up, sit down, or we're going to whack you with that ruler again. At Parma Senior High School, Biagio penned the play Me and Grandma. He directed and acted in the autobiographical production put up at the high school. The play went on to win the Marilyn Bianchi Young Playwrights Festival. It was later produced at Cleveland's Obama Theater. After high school, Biagio studied theater and film while at Cleveland's Cuyahoga Community College, and while there he earned a living acting in television commercials and directing videos for the Department of Public Safety, as well as composing soundtracks for the productions. And I think you delivered a pizza or two somewhere in there.
Oh, yeah.
He also wrote plays for DARE, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education, program. Biagio is then accepted to the School of Theater, Film, and TV at UCLA, which is really hard to get into. And on his third day of school, he met his future wife and business partner, Joke. Together, they made a feature film version of Biagio's play, Me and Grandma. They produced and directed the movie between their junior and senior years of college. Biagio also acted in the film. Me and Grandma screened at festivals. It also helped Biagio earn an audition for the Nickelodeon sitcom Kenan and Kel. He was cast as Mark Cram, Kenan's geeky next-door neighbor. And it says
typecasting.
The typecasting in parentheses. He joined for seasons 3 and 4 of the hit teen sitcom. Other acting jobs included Nickelodeon's All That and NBC's medical drama ER. He considers the highlight of his acting career meeting the Coen brothers during a callback audition. Joel and Ethan inspired Biagio with their kind, welcoming demeanor and creative vision. It's something that Biagio works to emulate in his own productions. Joke and Biagio undertook more projects, and Biagio moved behind the camera full-time. Together with his then fiancée, Joke, the duo formed what would become Joke Productions. A crew of 2, they filmed everything from local commercials to video game trailers. Backstage Magazine West named their company as one of the best to film and edit actors' demo reels. Wish I had known you when my daughter Hannah was pursuing a career in acting. Video Maker magazine called them digital video gurus. Joke and Biagio also produced independent documentaries. During that time, Biagio edited hundreds of hours of independent film and video projects. Excuse me. He became proficient with Avid, Adobe Premiere, and Apple Final Cut Pro. He created 2D and 3D graphics and visual effects for paying clients. Those are the best kind. I love paying clients, as well as writing original music for many productions. He convinced Joke, I was going to rewrite that to say he begged Joke to marry him in 2001.
Begged is more accurate. I'd go with begged. Yeah, I mean, listen, I outkicked my coverage, man. She is awesome.
She is awesome. Yeah, just an amazing woman on so many levels. It was by far one of the 3 greatest days of his life. The other 2 were the birth of his daughter and the birth of his son. Having kids has also expanded Biagio's awareness of the entertainment landscape. He used to binge watch TV shows like The Wire. These days it's more like marathon sessions of Caillou, Super Y, and Frozen. After several hundred hours of entertainment, Biagio Messina is still a hands-on producer. He films, runs interviews, not this one, baby, it's all me, polishes edits, creates graphics, visual effects, and composes original music and theme songs for the company's TV series. Along with his wife, Joke, he creates the visual style for their TV and film productions. His goal is to elevate great stories with amazing visuals. He enjoys pushing the limits of motion picture technology, but most of all, he loves running a company with his extraordinary wife, Joke. And I'll second that. I added a little note here to say Joke is an extraordinary woman, and I would have invited her to join us today. But music is probably not her favorite. Well, it's not that it's her least favorite thing. It's just she's involved in pretty much every other aspect of what they do, except so much the music. So today, Biagio...
Well, she tells me when she doesn't like it. I mean, that's which is important. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's all wives, or all spouses, I should say. Today, Biagio and Joe produce all kinds of mostly unscripted TV shows, many of which are in the true crime genre for networks like, I didn't fix that.
Investigation Discovery? Is that
that. I still had it down as something else. You said, you should probably change it. Investigation Discovery and other networks. And I've got to say, when we go out for dinners, they share some incredible stories of the behind-the-scenes stuff that you can't put on television. And just like... what they do for a living, most of us wouldn't have the guts to do, like doing ride-alongs with cops when they're actually like out really arresting people and interesting stuff that I probably shouldn't talk about. Anyway, so now that I've introduced you to my multi-talented friend, I have a request to make of you who are watching us. Please don't Google him and try to send your music. I know that many of you will. Kind of happened after the road rally, but when Biagio is not using his own music in his shows, the networks that he works for ask him or demand of him to use pre-approved libraries that they've already cut deals with and signed off on. So he can't just say, I love your music, Taxi member. Sure, I'll be happy to use it. So
right. And to be clear, or vet it, there's a whole lot of legal hurdles. And so it's really like an individual musician. It's hard to pitch me because you got to have insurance and lawyers and just all kinds of stuff. So getting a network to say, okay, on a library is an important thing I got to handle on my end. And it sucks for individual musicians, but we're going to give tips that are going to help individual musicians today. So it's all going to be worth it.
Right. And there are taxi members who are in the libraries that Biagio uses on his shows. And I'll have him tell you a story in a minute about that. It's something I just found out yesterday. Anyway, share the story of how we met. It's a cute story. It's a very cute story. So lay it on us.
Well, it is. And first of all, wow, thank you for that marathon introduction. I'm so sorry. I feel like somehow you managed to pull every bio I ever wrote in my life together and shine it up. So thank you. And I hope people are still watching because I'm not nearly as cool as Michael made me sound, but thank you. So, okay, how we became friends. It's kind of a cool twisting story, and I'll try to keep it short. But it actually started as what I was hoping would be a life lesson for my kids. So sometimes to their enjoyment, sometimes to their chagrin, I make it a habit to play tutorials and how-to podcasts when I'm with my kids. Not all the time, but a lot. Because I want them to see that, yeah, even though dad owns a company, like, I don't know everything. You got to keep learning. I'm a lifelong learner. I want them to be learners. My hair's turning white. I still got a lot to learn. That's just the way it is. So I'm very open with them about saying, like, you got to keep learning stuff. Dad does, you do. One of those things that we had happened to be listening to for a while was Taxi TV. So they know you. They'd seen you around the house. They heard you, in the car from time to time. All right. So one morning, we're getting ready for school, and I got the iPhone up, and it's a YouTube channel, and you are on another YouTube channel, another YouTuber. And my kids come running over, and they're like, Daddy, that's Michael. That's not Taxi TV. Keep in mind, we don't know each other at this point, but my kids know you. Right. So, and I'm like, well, you know what? Let me tell you what's going on. And I said, actually, this YouTuber had some questions about Taxi, and they run a separate community, and it's a good community, a good thing, but they ask some hard questions. And Michael, instead of shying away or instead of getting mad, he decided to go on this podcast and answer questions honestly. And I said, no, look at this. I really want you to look at this. I said, here's Michael, and here's somebody who doesn't necessarily agree with him. But look how they're talking to each other. They're being friendly. They're agreeing on some things. They're disagreeing on others. That's the way life should be. And in the meantime, we're getting a bunch of tips about writing music cues. I'm like, isn't that great? And my kids are like, yeah, Dad, they're into it. They're not into it, but I'm trying to give them the lesson, right? So we drove to school, and we listened to the audio of the rest of it while I was dropping them off. And as they get there, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go one better on this. So I said, you know what, guys? What did you think of Michael going on there? And my son was like, yeah, that was brave. And my daughter was like, yeah, it's nice that he went on and talked. I said, you know what? I'm gonna write him an email. And my son goes, you know Michael? And before I can answer, my daughter goes, no, he doesn't. Michael's important. No. Leave it to kids to keep you humble. So I'm like, well, Michael is important. And no, I don't know him. I said, and honestly, he may never get my email. He may never respond. And I said, that's okay. I said, here's what I want you to get out of this. Michael went and did something hard. And I bet he gets a lot of emails where people are like, I don't like this, or I'm complaining about that, or whatever. I said, how many people write to say something nice? I said, when you guys come across somebody that you think did something good, reach out, say something nice. I said, I'm going to write an email. Probably I'm never going to hear back, and that's okay. Put a little good in the world when you can. So my kids are like, okay, Dad, sure, yeah, Michael's going to read your email. All right, I wrote you the email that morning. I go back, I'm picking them up after school. We're driving away, my phone rings, and it's an unlisted phone number. And, I don't pick it up. I let it go to voicemail. But the visual voicemail popped up, and I can see, the first words of, what the voicemail was. And it said, hi, Biagio, this is Michael Laskow. And I went, holy crap, Michael Laskow called me. And my kids are like, what? Michael called you? It's like, but Dad, he owns a company. And now I'm like, okay, now hold on a minute. I mean, me and your mom own a company. And my daughter's like, Dad, he owns Taxi. They do Taxi TV. I'm like, we make TV shows, but okay. I'm like, listen, I'm as thrilled as you are. I'm like, I'm going to call him later and we'll see what it is. And so sure enough, we hopped on the phone that night and we hit it off about music and our love of Korean barbecue, and been fast friends ever since. But that was how it all started, was me wanting to show my kids, hey, look at this guy, Michael. He's doing the right thing. He's answering some hard questions, doing it in a nice way. And look, people who disagree can get along. So thanks for teaching my kids that lesson and for becoming my newest and one of my dearest friends. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm so grateful that you did that. First of all, I try to do things like that as well. I just, after the road rally, sent an email to the two vice presidents who are above the general manager of the Westin where we did it, because he's a new GM there. And he was so much better than the last several previous GMs, and both VPs wrote me back and said, thank you for letting us know that. People appreciate it. They do want to hear the good stuff. So yeah, that first time we went out to dinner, it's like we didn't even know where to start. Do we talk about music? Do we talk about their life in producing TV shows? We talked about all kinds of stuff. I think that dinner went like 3.5 hours or something, and we clearly hit it off. We've both remarked several times since how great it is to make a dear friend, somebody you would call a close, dear, cherished friend this late in life. Usually the friends you have at all ages are the ones you made in high school or college or in your 20s. But yeah, we get along great and go out for regular dinners. Oftentimes Joke goes with us. My wife is studying abroad for a year, so she's only been out to dinner with them one time. So it's kind of a threesome every time we go out, and it's just the best time. Anyway, so first time we went out, I asked Biagio about his approach for creating music for TV and film. He told me that he thinks of how to create music in a way that's even more useful than simply creating kind of standard instrumental cues. So can you share that with our viewers, and don't be afraid to go into depth on this. Yeah, we've got time and they should hear it.
Great. Well, I mean, I could talk about this all day. First of all, do I sound like I'm screaming? I get all excited when I talk to you. So if I need to dial it back a little bit, let me know.
No, that's fine. Your audio's getting a little weird again, but it's never bad. It goes from being B+ to A+. I think it's a bad wire somewhere, literally, because it has nothing to do with how close or far you are from the mic. But yeah, and he's a perfectionist, by the way, so this is going to bug the crap out of him, but oh well.
Yeah, well, my apologies to everybody who's listening. If my audio dips a little bit here and there, I'll just try to keep it, I'll try to project. But, this, I really want to get this right. I knew Michael might ask me about this, and I have a couple of notes that I might reference, because I think of everything that I could possibly share, this is probably the one thing nobody really knows about, because unless you write music, and then you sit in Bay and edit it, and then you're the executive producer at the end of it who sees what happens with the network and the music and the stages it goes through. These are things you would never really know about, I think. And when I've had conversations with other musicians, they seem to be really interested in it. So let me just start at the beginning, okay? I think one thing that I learned over the years is it is a huge mistake to look at a cue, whether you're an editor, and really, even if you're the composer or the library, and think that cue, that beautiful, polished final cue is the most important piece of the puzzle. Most of the time, for me, it's the least important part of the puzzle. So let me get into what that means exactly. I thought about this long and hard when Michael asked me about it the first time we went out, and you asked me to, talk about it at the Taxi Road Rally, which I was so flattered. And I was like, I want to get this right. And I think the easiest way to think about what makes a cue work and what gets you placed over and over again. And the cues I come back to, whether they're mine or a library's, and it's more library cues than mine, because I don't have time to do every cue on our shows. So I have deep respect for libraries, but it's two things. One, is your cue a toolkit? And two, does it have what I call cue survivability? That's a stupid term I made up myself, but it makes sense in my head. And I think you're going to see why it's important. So first of all, what makes a cue a toolkit? And for me, it's one thing. It's the intelligent creation of stems. Now, what do I mean by stems? Because, Michael, I know you obviously have a storied career, as an audio engineer, and the actual definition of STEM probably is different than the colloquial way producers and editors use it. But to us, a STEM is basically any element of a cue that can be broken out and handed to us to use on its own. It could be a solo violin. It could be an entire brass section. It could be just the drums. It could be just the perk. And now this might sound simple, stupid, until you come to know how we use these stems and why they're so important. Because for us, stems become like Lego bricks. They become little chunks that help us pseudo score our scenes. And I'll explain what I mean by pseudo score. And it actually helps you collaborate with me in the edit bay long after you wrote your cue. Without ever knowing what I actually need, you're collaborating me post writing this cue. It's like magic. And really, I feel that way. So let's talk about stems first and why we need them. It's not like I want more work. It's not like I want to have, 100 stems to increase our editing time, or I don't want to just throw your cue under there. But it's really, really hard to sort of differentiate your show from other shows on television. One of the best ways I think to do that is intelligently using music. And one of the worst ways to be like every other show on television is I hear some hammering over there, Michael.
Yeah, we've got stems. They're pouring a concrete slab outside of my office. They said they'd be done at 1:00. I think done pouring at 1:00. Now they're taking down the forms with sledgehammers. I'm so sorry, Biagio, and I'm sorry to the audience. Let's just keep it rolling. And...
No, 100%. I felt like I had to acknowledge it.
Yeah, thank you.
But what happens is, and again, I want to call out music libraries and music library owners. You have the hardest job in the world. I love you to death. You save our shows when they're in trouble by making sure we have great music. You don't get thanked nearly enough. You deal with all the crap that's in this business and just trying to get your music into our edit bays. So please know you're so appreciated, and the work you do to deliver us great music, I can't thank you enough. It is. I think it's the hardest job in showbiz, being a music library owner. It's a tough market out there. Thank you for what you do. Okay. So a good music library will deliver us not just the cues, but those stems. And what I tell my editors, I'm like, I do not want you to cut a scene over the top of a cue. Why? Because let's face it, a good production cue should have a recognizable pattern. It should, right? It's either going to be AABA or it's going to be typical trailer structure. Anybody who's studied production music at all, you know that there's several forms that pop up again and again. Well, from a producer's point of view, if you watch a lot of reality shows, I'm not going to call any out because I'm not into ragging on shows, but you'll notice that shows start to have a certain rhythm. And it kind of comes from scenes being cut almost to that AABA structure, or almost having an edit point or a break, near the same point that you normally would in a production music cue. That's not a fault of the composer or the music library. That's a benefit. We need to understand what's in that cue. That cue is a blueprint of everything that's in the toolkit of that cue. Again, what's the toolkit? It's the stems. So what I tell our editors to do, I say, first and foremost, if you can, I want the scene to work with no music in it at all. Okay? I want you to cut the scene to the natural rhythm that feels right for our show and that scene. And I don't want it to be messed with by a pre-existing, structure that comes with a cue. They can't do that all the time because we have deadlines. But with big key scenes, we can think about it that way. Once that happens, then I want them to find a cue that has the tools they need. And an easy way to understand this is, say we've got a cue with piano and strings, right? And you've got the melody is some light piano notes, and the bass, your underlying bed, you've got some strings, maybe some pads, okay? What I'm going to want them to do, based on how they feel about the scene, is maybe slowly bring in just the strings and no piano for 30 seconds. A cue is never going to do that. A production library is not going to hand you a cue that's 30 seconds of strings. No one's going to know what to do with it. Mm-hmm. But when you're editing a scene, right, that might be the perfect way, and you just want to have these light strings, right? Now, those melodic notes, a little inside baseball. As an editor, I like to avoid, at least in the beginning of scenes, having melodic notes hit at the same time somebody is talking, okay? Right. Because they're talking. A melodic note is a very powerful colorful comment, or it can be, on what's happening in the scene, you don't want those two hitting at the same time, right? Kind of like the way you don't want certain instruments to clash, so you would never compose them over the top of each other. So what happens is we edit those strings, we edit those pads, and then we re-edit your melody, so those notes land in between dialogue. This is a very simple example of how we use your music as a toolkit to score our scenes. And again, this is like you helping us after you wrote the cue, because you gave us the tools. If I was locked in to your piano melody and your strings and your pads, it would be a big pain in the butt at best and unusable at worst to try to cut it so that those notes are landing between the dialogue, and without me having to compromise the internal rhythm of the scene to match your music. Does that make sense? Or am I getting too artsy?
No, it does make sense, but it sounds like a lot of work and a big time suck. And most people would just say, screw it, good enough, and move on and not give it the care. But honestly, having watched, several of your episodes over the last 18 months or whatever, you can feel the difference. You really can. You can feel the love and feel the care with which it was made. And I just can't imagine that many other EPs, executive producers or anybody at any level working on a show that has anything to do with the music, which is usually the editor. Usually a music supervisor approves stuff from within a library, hands it off to the editor. The editor's got it in a digital bin. They pull up a playlist and they know that they can use what's on that list. But they're not giving it that same forethought that you are. It's like, we can use these pieces and move them around. And you made it very clear by saying essentially we're scoring. That makes it so understandable. So I think that you might be the Lone Ranger in doing that. Other people, well, you could be. When you told me that night at dinner, I was like in shock. I went, I've never heard that before, and I've been in the industry longer than you've been alive.
Well, right. Well, see, and that was what really surprised me. It excited me. Yeah. I will tell you, I don't want to make myself sound like I'm some genius. Good editors do this all the time. Okay. And again, I was lucky enough. I was first introduced to stems as a producer, and I've edited on every show we've ever made. It's just how I work. But a guy named Dave Pellman, who runs Dave Pellman Music, we worked with him on a VH1 show, and he had these stems, and it just opened my eyes to a whole new world. And we started getting real compliments from networks about the way we used music. And that was when I really started pushing into stems. But I'm not the only one. And anyways, that's a very simple example, though. That's sort of like strings and music notes. And honestly, that's something I can do in my sleep. Sometimes I don't even need to listen back to it. I can just look at the waveform, chop it up, put it, and I know it's going to work. I cut that fast because a good cue will give you the flexibility to do that. Okay. I want to talk about one more sort of element of that and why these Lego bricks is the way I think of stems is important. And I mentioned that briefly, which is cue survivability, right?
Yeah.
Now, this happens all the time. And I would say about 50% of the cues survive and about 50% don't. And the ones that don't have good enough stems, usually. And here's why. Let me give you an example. So there's a thing called an act out. In linear television is like your traditional cable or TV where you've got commercials, right? Mm-hmm. An act out is the last scene before you go to commercial break. So think about a famous act out, for instance, think about the scripted show Lost. Pretty much every act ended with that reverse sound effect of the cabin air pressure, right? Sucking out that reminded you about the airplane. It was that same sound effect every time. On a true crime show, like some of the ones we do, or any kind of action show, right? It's going to be some big trailer-esque, building up to that final thud and take you out to commercial. We get network notes on our edits, right? So I would say a good chunk of the time, the scene that we cut as our act out now moves to the middle of an act where that cue is completely inappropriate. Wow. You can't be in the middle of an act and all of a sudden it's a huge trailer cue and now we're back to a little piano cue. So what has happened though is that, a cue has been, a scene has been cut to a cue that we're now familiar with. Certain moments still work, certain rhythms still work, the way maybe we moved some of those melodic notes. And so if we have enough stems, I can rip out all that trailer stuff. I can rip out the stuff I don't need. I can rip out the stuff that feels too big and still use 80% of the work I did when I edited that act out the first time. So now your cue, which was an act out and sounded completely differently, just got moved to the middle of the act. And guess what? You still make the cue sheet. You're making the same amount of money you would have made either way. It doesn't matter, right? You want those minutes on the cue sheet. So I always think that to me is a great reason why people should put more thought into their stems. Is one, you're collaborating with us after the fact. I'm editing a scene and I'm using your toolkit to score my scene. And two, when I get network notes and the whole show changes, if I can make your cue sound different enough so that it works for the new mood I need in the middle of the scene or wherever it goes to, or vice versa from the middle to the end, right? I can. Your cue stays in the show. It saves me time. It makes you money. So put thought into those stems. I made just a short list because I come back to this myself about what I think the most useful stems are. If anybody wants to know.
They do. Trust me.
Great. Again, I can really geek out on this, so hopefully it's not getting boring. But I would say, first and foremost, any solo instruments. You got a solo violin, you got a solo guitar, a piano. I want that all by itself. And a piano, if you can separate the right hand from the left hand and give me both, even better. Okay.
And I want to add something, if I may, as an audio engineer and a retired post mixer as well. Don't just take the 12 seconds of a string line and make that the whole thing. You need to start at the downbeat and let it run all the way through. Leave it where it was on the musical timeline and keep the levels where they were in your mix. Otherwise, when Biagio goes to use it, now he has to move it and adjust the level of it. So if you just leave it where it was in the mix, even if it's barely moving your meters and it sounds low to you, it's contextually still correct. So there you go.
Yes, 100%. And that's one of the main things. Please make sure all your stems are the exact same length. Because what it looks like in my edit bay, when I get in there and I'm really started doing this, is I have like 12. Think about your DAW, right? Think about your tracks in your DAW. That's how my edit bay looks like on the audio half. And I've got all your stems one on top of the other. And I can take away this part and I can cut that part and I can come back to this part. So I sync them all up and I'm chopping and editing between them as I need to. So the minute I get a stem that's like, a different length than the rest of the cue, I'm like, I can't do it. I'm not even going to start with this cue. That doesn't happen a lot with the big libraries we work with, but I have certainly seen it. And it's like, it's a bummer because then it's a lot of manual work to sync it up. So thank you. That's really important. Another thing to me is to think about the sections of your music. And I like them broken out into high, low, and all. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Let's say you've got an orchestral cue and you've got strings. I like the high strings. I like the low strings. I like all the strings. If you have the time, give me your short strings separate than your long strings. So I've got your ostinatos and I've also got your pad light strings. I mean, I'll use them all. The more stems you give me, the better.
And you know what? There's a monetary bonus in there for the musicians, because if you love a cue and it gives you enough stems within the toolkit, you could use that at 5 different places in an episode versus just using it once.
It happens all the time. It happens all the time because sometimes, and actually it happens for a reason you might not realize, which is a lot of times we have multiple editors working on an episode. And so an editor might have used the same cue without talking to each other and not realizing it. But if I have the stems and we can make them sound different enough from each other, then it's just like, okay, we'll just yank these stems here, change the intro a tiny bit on the music editing here, and it's fine. Nobody ever knows because it sounds different. That happens all the time. So very, very true, Michael.
And it must give the show an overall feel like you hired somebody to score it, because you've got this almost thematic familiar music that's showing up in its various forms in all the right places. Wow.
It can. And we can talk about that more later too, because on certain shows that's more of a thing than others. And that'll come back to, I know, some of the other questions you have. But again, just as far as like those sections go, strings, brass, pads, synths, high, low, all, long, short, break those up. Drums and perk. Don't be afraid to strip out the shakers and the hats and the big drums and into their own stems. And and I'm going to touch on an important point in a second here, because also really important to me is your transition stem. If it's a hybrid cue, or even if it's just cymbal scrapes or whatever, I want to have those transitions by themselves. You'd be amazed how often those transitions get used even all by themselves, because we need a stinger and an editor likes the stinger from another cue and saved it and reused it over here. Same with effects and hits. If you got some cool design booms, you got some cool designed hits, we strip those out all the time. But please, and I know every library will tell you this, you can't just download elements from Splice or Loop Cloud and put them naked in a stem. Number one, that's against the rules of those places. And number two, it can cause issues. I feel like, to be honest, I feel like it's less show in the type of TV we make, but I do know for libraries, putting those things in a naked stem is a bad idea. So when I create an effects stem, when I'm building my effects, when I'm building my transitions, a lot of times, sure, they have elements of a splice or another royalty-free sound in there, but those things are twisted, bent, pitch shifted. I got Sound Toys effects all over them, top to bottom. They sound nothing alike. So when that stem goes out, not only is it more bespoke for the cue, it's not going to trigger any content ID issues. So you really got to be careful about that, because transitions, effects and hits, drums and perk, those are so useful to us as editors. But if you take a hi-hat loop, and you just pop it in straight from Splice, I think technically you're going against their terms of service, and it could cause issues with content ID and the way the whole future of music fingerprinting is going. Like, just, you got to make it your own, So, if you got a hi-hat loop, make sure you put some other hi-hatty instruments on top of it and pitch it, time stretch it, all those things. Do all the things. Just make it yours, And then, what if you're dealing with a library, by the way, that doesn't want stems? It's unfortunate. I wish all libraries would do stems, but they only want alts. The most important, and by alt, they ask for like alternate versions. So some libraries will have the main cue, and there'll be like 4 or 5 alts. The most important for me is no melody, and then no drums, and then atmospheric. But it takes a big nosedive, because a lot of times they have those alts, but they don't have the melody by itself. So it completely screws up that situation I explained to you, which probably I do once per act in every television show, where I'm stripping the melody from the strings and reorganizing it to the dialogue. So that's a huge loss for anybody that doesn't give me those stems. But if a library only wants alts, the no melody is important, the no drums is important, the atmospheric is important. By the way, this goes for solo piano cues too. I think I kind of mentioned this, but I mean, you could get really creative with how you rip those apart. You could even, I've had piano cues that are ripped in 3, where they're the really high notes, the chords, and the bass notes, and I've used them. I use all those stems. I mean, I edit a lot of stuff.
Are there libraries that every single cue in the library has stems with it?
Absolutely. If you want to see, by the way, I love all my libraries that I use.
Yeah, don't mention a company name if you're about to, just because people will swamp them and try and pitch them. And
gotcha.
Where'd you hear about us? Oh, on Taxi.
Right. Okay. So there is one, and I won't say who they are. I mean, there's a few of the big ones, but there is one that is the undisputed champion of stems. If I want to know I've got flexibility, I pull a cue from that library. They almost overdo it, because one cue can have up to 150 or 200 alts and stems.
Who has the time to do that?
Well, I think that they have really committed composers, because even when I do my own cues, I tend to output anywhere between 25 and 30 stems.
That's a lot. Wow.
It is, but I know that I'm going to use them, and I know my editors will use them, so for me it's worth it. But yeah, I mean, they're also doing, that includes like cut downs, which are like 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 10 seconds, and all the versions of that. I almost never use a cut down, because if I want 30 seconds, I want my 30 seconds, not your 30 seconds.
Right.
And I'm going to build that out of stems. So for me, for advertising and people who do that, those cut downs are important. Not for me. But yeah, there are, if people want to poke around and go visit some of the big libraries, you can compare. I mean, they're you can see what kind of stems they have. And a lot of times, a lot of libraries use a thing called source audio, which is a back end. And you can see next to it how many stems or alts are. It'd be like +5 or +26. If I'm at that library and I got a +5 versus a +26, I'm going with the +26 because I know from the get-go it's going to give me more flexibility.
That's a key piece of information right there, because there's nothing more composers, musicians, people making music for media. The bottom line question for all of them all the time is, what can I do to get more placements? And a big answer is create more stems.
By the way, not only get the placements, but keep them. I come back to this freaking cue survivability. I know it sounds dumb, but I'm telling you, we lose half the cues every show. And the ones that stick are the ones that have great stems.
Wow.
It just happens. So many cues go into cut one that never make it to the end. They're out. And if I can keep a cue and just rip out some stems, it's a lot easier for me. I'm telling you, and those are the cues that last to the end. You'd be shocked when the cues get ripped out. And when I get tossed, I think I said this already, but when I get introduced to a new library, or the network's like, these are the libraries we want you to use, or, a library comes to me and is like, can you get a network to approve me? The first thing I ask, what are your stems like? I got to know, because I can't, it kills me to commit to a cue and then have to change it later. It's a waste of time.
I imagine there's some musicians sitting at home right now thinking, well, if he's in the edit bay working on a show and I don't have any stems or enough stems, he could simply email me and I'll create a bunch for us.
Yeah, we have like 2-3 days sometimes to turn around and cut. No, there's no time. Yeah. There's no time. Your cut's getting, your cue's getting pulled, and we're popping in something else. There's no time. Even doing the pseudo scoring I talk about, I mean, you're right. It takes longer. I'm not the only one who does it, but it is good editors and producers who give a crap about their shows will take the time to do that. And in my case, I'm lucky because I'm an editor. So at the end, sometimes it's just me and my wife joke. Everyone else is gone, and I'm doing final polishes on the shows long after the budget is gone, because that's why we started the company. We want to make our shows, Yeah. And I can work for free as long as I want. It's my company. So when the money's gone, I'm sitting there at the end. And these are the things that I've learned in those last moments before you finally send it off to the network, especially about music. So I hope that makes sense to people, and I hope they put it to use, because it does make a difference. I've seen it over and over again for the last 20 years.
That's life-changing advice. I'm telling you, when you told me that at our first dinner, and like I said, I used to do audio post at a very high level on big commercials every day of the year, but back then libraries were still on 1/4-inch stereo tape. And then around 1985, 86, they started moving over to CD, but stems didn't exist back then. And there was a guy named Jim Long, who's kind of the Clive Davis of production music libraries, who's actually the first industry person I met when I moved to LA. Greatest mentor ever, sadly since passed away a few years ago, but he started a library, I want to say it was called Liquid Tracks, where they actually had stems on CD libraries. And I looked at that and I went, wow, how much time did it take you to bust all those out and organize it and get it on CDs? And he said, you'll see, this is the future. And he was the kind of guy that was right about everything. Very prescient guy.
By the way, just before we move on, I do want to say it's actually not that hard to bust out your stems. And I will tell you, Michael is right. Like, don't change the levels, but like, you've already mixed your cue. You've got your strings separated from your drums, from your bass. Just solo them and export them. Even if they run through the mastering chain, I don't care. We'll adjust them in our bay. Like, it doesn't have to be perfection. And sometimes, and this happens all the time in cues, right? Like, you've edited a particular instrument and maybe it cuts out weird because that works good for the mix. In the context of the mix, it sounds great. The stem sounds weird. I don't care. That's fine. Give me the weird sounding stem. If I need to add a reverb tail, that's easy. I'll do that. Just give me the stems. I'll use them. It doesn't have to be hard. Exporting it takes me probably an extra 20 minutes to export all the stems once a cue is done. So it's worth it.
And then the next day you go, I don't like the mix.
Well, luckily I got the stems.
Right. So. There you go. I'm going to skip my next question. It kind of runs together. As you're looking for your next piece of music, for the next scene or a beat, and just so everybody knows, a beat is a moment or some moments within a scene. Like Biagio and I meet at the restaurant and we tell the guy at the front desk, yes, it's reservation for Messina +1. That's a beat.
Sounds like a dramedy.
Yeah.
Dramedy.
So, beats are moments, basically, not an entire scene. So anyway, you've got a beat. You need to lay some music in there. And now you're looking at a digital bin of these tracks, basically a very long playlist broken out by genres with tags that describe what they are, blah, blah, blah. So I've been preaching this for years, and I may have been the first person to, honestly, not to pat myself on the back, but titles, I know they're important because I used to rely on them when I was still mixing commercials. Are titles of the cues important to you as an editor? I scan that list and go to the stuff with the titles that telegraph what you're looking for, what the music sounds like, what the mood might be, whatever?
In my role as an editor, not as important. In my role as the default music supervisor, who at first is building out all the bins for our editors, which I do.
Wow.
Yes. So this is the thing, right? You have a large hurdle to go through to not only get your music signed by a library that's big enough to be working with television shows like the ones we make or bigger shows, but to also end up in the edit bay. Okay, by the time you've made it into our edit bay, you've got our attention either with the title or how good your cue is or how well it works for this show. And that happens a lot of different ways, right? Sometimes the libraries are pulling playlists for us. If a library pulls a playlist for me, I don't even look at the titles. It's a great, but guess what? I had a conversation with a library like literally last week that I'll tell you more about that later, but titles were extremely important to them. Extremely. And they talked about how those titles help them decide where to place it on the playlists preemptively that make it to us. So I think that depending on where you're at in the pipeline, your title will end up being important and can be a decision maker. I'll tell you a funny story. I have this ridiculous cue that gets used all the time by my editors, and it's called Fart of Death. And it's just a hit and a sort of like a trombone-y, drone-y thing. But when it's late at night and then they're going for one of those cues and they see Fart of Death, I guess they thought it was funny, and that thing got used like crazy, right? So, at different times, your title works in your favor, and I think you want to give yourself every opportunity to be the cue that gets picked. Now, as an editor, here's where we're at. Because of, maybe your title at some point, and because the library thought your cue was good, and the library thought your cue could work for a certain playlist, or because someone like me who is a geek and owns the company and wants to go find my own music, went to the library and built my own playlist, you've now made it to this bin, okay? That bin can live in our edit bay, which is our, like Adobe Premiere, it's sort of like our version of your DAW. Right? That's our editing software. We use Premiere. I've also used Avid and Final Cut and now Resolve. It just depends on the show. You've made it there. Now, I don't even audition the music inside the edit bay because it takes too long. And I have seen other editors do the same thing, and it's going to sound terrifying. And I'll tell you what you can do to help yourself. We happen to be on Macs. I go to the Finder. I open up the Finder level folder. I hit the space bar to spotlight it, and it's this. Click, 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 click. Okay, what am I listening for, and why did I pass those other 5-6 cues? All right. Do you really have to get my attention in 1 second? Yeah. Sorry. Wow,
you don't listen to the entirety of my cue? How can you judge it without? Yeah.
I mean, you're cutting for so many hours a day. If we listen to every cue top to bottom, it would be a huge mess. So step one, what am I listening for? Did you get my attention with either a unique signature sound or at least a recognizable invite to your cue that matches the mood I'm looking for? One of the things that kills more cues for me than anything, and I hate to say it because I know some libraries might even ask for it, is like a fade in on a drone. Ooh. I'm moving on because and there's a lot of cues that fade in. I'm guilty of writing them myself, especially if I'm writing to picture because I'm like, whatever, I don't care. I know I'm going to use it. But when you're going that fast, what am I listening for? Here's what gets my attention. If you have a signature sound that you've built somewhere in your cue that's unique, please find a way to feature it in the first 10, 15 seconds. And if you can, make it the first thing I hear, because it's a signature sound. It's automatically different. It automatically makes your cue non-generic.
So when you say signature sound, are you talking about an instrument sound, a type of instrument? Or are you talking about like, hang on, I think I might, well, like that, bump, but a bump.
Yeah. So that to me would be more what I would think of as a music. Okay, I'm making this up as I go, but I'm trying to give a phrase to it. That would be like a musical invite.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a fade up. It's
right.
something that tells me right off the bat what the beat is. A signature sound for me, and I'll give you an example. On our show Operation Undercover, we did a lot of cues like this, which is how do I use an interesting sound we captured in the field and build a cue around it. I do this all the time on our shows because this is how I make sure if I take the time to do a cue, it really doesn't sound like anything else. Is like I have a cue called Fear the Cuffs. And there was a scene where there was like 5 different hand cuff clicks. And I just built the whole, basically the whole perk section out of that. Some of the booms were the boots hitting the ground, jumping out of the Bearcat when they would land. I had another cue called Who Let the Dogs Shout, which I think is a fairly clever title. The editor seemed to like that one. And it was a dog that the sound man had captured, a stray dog, when the cops were rolling out. What are all these thumbs up? Is that me?
No, it's not me either. I'm literally not touching it.
Wait, if I stick my thumbs up, does it do that? Whoa!
I have never seen this in all.
What is happening?
I have no idea where this is coming from.
I'm going to keep my hands to myself before my head explodes. That was crazy.
Let's see if it happens with me. No, it's just you.
That
is so
okay.
weird.
I'm crossing my arms out of fear. So he had captured a dog barking when the undercover agents were rolling out to a bus, and I thought this one dog bark had a really cool sound. So I took that, I played with some sound toys, plugins. I stretched it a little bit so it still had the essence of a dog bark. But I used it as just sort of like an interesting percussive accents here and there, and it gave it this sort of raw quality, And so to me, a signature sound is like, can you take, whether it's a musical instrument or a diegetic sound effect or something you just record in the next room, stretch it into something only you have. It's not hard. I try to do that once or twice on every cue I do, because at least I know at the end of the day it's mine. I like to believe, so Dave Porter, again, a little side note, Dave Porter was the composer for, among other things, Breaking Bad. And he would do the coolest stuff. Like there was a scene where there was like this little porcelain cup in the scene that played a small role in the scene. So he got a porcelain cup and he built a perk track out of that. That famous shaker sound at the end of the Breaking Bad theme was him with a little pot of beans over a microphone, It just makes it yours. I like to think that on some level, the viewer might actually like connect on like some subconscious level. They're like, oh, it's something from somewhere in the scene and it gives me a deeper connection. And then my wife will be like, people are watching the show while they do their laundry. Nobody is ever going to pick up on that. But at best, in some creative utopia, it's what I aim for. And at worst, I got a cue no one else has, right? And some sounds no one else has. Long way of saying, if you've taken the time to do that somewhere in your cue, could your cue start with that sound? Can it be in the first 10 seconds? Because that's something you got that no one else has. And it's not the boom from, Albion 1 that everybody uses all the time, including me, because sometimes you're in a hurry. It's just something that's yours. So get the most mileage out of it. Another thing is like a melodic fragment is fine to pull me in with. A couple of piano notes that then launch into something bigger. Those drums in the beginning of your cue that you play here on Taxi TV, it's an invite that tells me what the cue is going to be. So now I'm zipping through these cues, and okay, the first second you got my attention. That's a cool sound. The mood is right for this beat. Okay, where's it go from here? Okay, do I like the first 10 seconds? Next step, I look at your waveform. And this is where most cues go out the window. Okay?
Is looking at a waveform something virtually all editors do, or just editors that are musicians themselves and know what it means?
No. You don't need to be a musician to do this. Good editors, listen, any editor I hire, or try when they're available, they do this instinctually, all right? But you got to remember, going back to pseudo scoring a scene, I may want the music to break. right? I want the music to go away for a second and let a dramatic line land. Or I want the music to go away and then have a big hit where we cut to some sweeping shot that makes an important statement about the scene. So I go to your waveform. Are there breaks? Some people call them edit points. Some people call them stop downs. Some people call them breaks. What it is a point where you've created a section of your music that goes almost to zero or all the way to zero before the next section starts.
You're talking about the level goes to zero, like because something people will put in an edit point, a rest, give it a full beat rest, but they'll let a reverb tail hang over or a string sustain or a piano note sustain.
Yeah,
which makes it really hard to cut into that because you're getting half or the tail of that thing. So
it does. It's a fine line, and I will say I've heard some composers, and I agree with them, say if you're smart about it, it doesn't have to go completely to zero, because if it goes down pretty low, we're just going to add a crossfade on our end. But if it rings out completely over, that's hard. And if there's no edit points at all, and I need one, I'm moving on, because it's much harder to create an edit point than it is to get rid of an edit point. Right? Because I can chop your music and just crossfade and do a music edit, and it's going to be fine. But if I need to create a music break, then I probably need to go and grab like some other kind of transition, and I got to cut your music on a beat. Whoa, there we go again with the thumbs up.
That's because you did a karate chop.
I did a karate chop. There's all these things that I need to do. I need to add a reverb tail. By the way, I do that if the cue is good enough or I'm far enough along. But no, I don't want to. So your waveform and I think libraries get this. Maybe a lot of composers don't, but visually, I do not have to spend 2.5 minutes listening to your cue or even 30 seconds to know if the break I need is there. I can see it in your waveform. So your waveform is the blueprint for me. I look at that waveform and I go, okay, edit point. 2 edit points. Now you're really selling me. I love 2 edit points in the queue. I think that's great.
So do you look at that before you listen to the first note?
No. So so once I get drawn in, because again, I'm going through the finder level. 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. And then, oh, wait, this sounds cool. Oh, 10 seconds are cool. What's the waveform look like?
Gotcha.
Did the waveform pass? You're coming to my last but not least. If I was editing for somebody else, which I assume our editors do here, my next step would be, does it have stems? I know anything in my bay has stems because I put it there. But that would be my next question. Does it have the stems I need? So did it get my attention and does it fit the mood of the scene? Are the first 10 seconds cool? Is there anything in there that sounds like a signature sound or at least doesn't sound like stock Omni?
What the hell? I have no idea where this is coming from. I've been using Wirecast for 5 or 6 years. I've done hundreds of shows. I've never had this happen. I think Wirecast is just happy to have you as our guest.
I'm a happy guy. What can I tell you? I think it's just cheering me on. Maybe it's like, why does this guy keep screaming? He must be really happy. And anyways, so those are the steps. Did it get my attention? Does it fit, does it fit the mood of the scene? How are the first 10 seconds? What's the waveform look like? Does it have stems? I'm pulling it in. Now I know I can do whatever I want with it. And it's that quick for every single scene. Now, again, in my shows, if you've already made it to the edit bay, I know I like your music. I know I like the cue because I picked them myself. But if you're an editor, working on something, you get handed a bin of cues, like good editors, that's more or less what they do. And that's what they're looking for.
They must love working for you because you give it so much thought and preparation before they ever put their tushy in the chair in the bay. It's like you allow them to be better at their jobs because you've done your homework up front for them.
I hope so. I'm sure I can also be annoying sometimes because who wants a boss who's also an editor? I apologize to them ahead of every show. I'm like, look, I know it's weird. I'm an editor. It's more than anything, more than writing music or directing or being a straight up producer, like editor is what I've always done. And every skill I have has flowed out. I mean, even editing thousands and thousands and thousands of music cues before I ever really sat down to write a real cue for one of our shows, like all that stuff helped me. So I just tell them, I'm like, look, don't take it personally if you get re-edited. It's not at all because you did a bad job. I have very specific things I need. The network knows they can tell me, hey, Biagio, can you just fix this really quick? And I will. I have those conversations all the time with network execs. But that's that's the process of picking the cue. So you got a signature sound. If you can start off with it, great. Otherwise, get it in that first 10, 15 seconds and make sure you got those edit points. And you've just massively increased your chances. Okay, even on drones. I like edit points in drones. I do.
Oh, you can't say drones this week.
That's right.
You can't turn on your TV without hearing the word drone 1,000 times.
That's right.
We had a lady, a woman, at a couple of road rallies named Laurel Ostrander, and she's a high-end editor, mostly unscripted TV. She did a great presentation in like 2018, 2019, I believe. And she talked about, she's musical enough. She understands music. So she would think in terms, in her capacity as an editor, oh, this would be a good place for a dramedy cue. But, you could be a good editor and not really know much about music. So do more editors think in terms of an emotion they're looking for music to create or add to the excitement of the action or something? Or do they think, oh, this would be a good place for a tension cue, or this would be a good place for a dramedy cue, or this would be a good place for, light acoustic dreamy music? How do editors think about what they're about to search for?
That is a really good question. And honestly, Michael, this comes back to something you've talked about so many times, so passionately on so many taxi TVs. And it's first and foremost, know your client, because that gives context to everything else. Okay. So many times you told that great story about like working in a store and, don't sell women's shoes to a guy that's looking for a blue shirt. Right.
Right.
I mean, so those decisions, by the time they're editing, major conversations have been had ahead of time. And let me give you a couple different examples. If you're doing a show for investigation discovery, you're going to have a very different musical language than you do if you're doing sort of like a big elevated documentary for Netflix or a streamer. Okay. They have different needs. Beyond that, it gets even crazier. If you're doing a show for a network with one network executive versus another network executive, you're going to have a completely different musical language. Same network. I got a network executive who said, I hate guitar. I never want to hear guitar. Don't ever use a guitar. We used guitar all over the show, but I think what he meant was he didn't want like a twangy, strummy, Western sounding, what in his mind was like, a guitar, not like a sweeping single note or how we all use guitars, guitar arps in the background. I mean, but to him, guitar was a big no-no. Different exec at that same network, completely different musical language, completely different. And these are things that sometimes you don't figure out till the second or third episode of a season. So again, speaking practically, let's say I'm an editor and I know I'm doing a show for investigation discovery, and I know what fits in with their access to action bucket, which, by the way, our show Operation Undercover does. It's a certain style of television they make where audience expects a certain tone. Now we know, okay, this is the sandbox we're playing in for music. You will never in a million years put a dramedy cue into a crime show that's access to action for investigation discovery, right? It doesn't matter.
Oh, come on. I disagree, because there's always the scene where the guy's being handcuffed and shoved in the back of the cop car and his girlfriend, who's on crack, meth, and every other thing, is saying, I've never met him before in my life. That'd be a great place for a dramedy cue.
Well, but you bring up an excellent point. At some networks, it might. Because at some networks, they might feel like we're not really about the drama. We want to milk a little bit more comedy out of this scene. Go with a little more reality feel. If you're more true doc, they may very much be like, listen, we don't ever want to make fun of the police or the criminals. We want to treat this seriously. So you've got this sort of playground. You've got this set of rules before you start. Now, one of the other things, and I know you talk about this all the time, reference. Right, you talk about it in terms of musicians getting reference cues when you do briefs. You always provide excellent references, right? You always say, if you got 5 dramedy references, right, don't go and send over a tension cue to that brief, but you're just shooting yourself in the foot, right? Yeah, you would never do that. Well, before our editors start, they're watching every single show on Investigation Discovery that's in the bucket we're working in. Not because we want to copy them, but we understand tonally. We understand the audience. You know, if you're an audience who likes to watch rom-coms and you sit down to watch a movie and you get some, you know, some crazy, you know, art film that's like the most serious, you know, slit my wrists thing you've ever seen, you're going to be very disappointed. So
is that an actual category, slit my wrists?
We call it slit my wrist TV. It was a thing back in the day. It's like if something was just way too serious or dramatic or depressing, who wants to watch that? You know, you come home and a lot of people will pitch true crime where it is just so depressing. And it's like, look, different people watch crime for different reasons. And a lot of times people watching crime, you know, on a Tuesday night, they just want to know that the person got caught. And they don't want to get into all the gory details. They want to know that some cop did a good job and arrested somebody and the bad guy went away. Someone else might want to watch TV because they like the fact that the woman killed her husband and they don't like their husband. And it becomes like a sick, like, ooh, yeah. Oh, but you know what? If you do murder your husband, that's what really happens. So, you know, that's a bad idea. And there's all kinds of different reasons I've heard why people watch true crime. But those are the thoughts, you know, they go into who are you presenting to? Why are they watching? And that affects your music choices. Now, to come back to it, so what do you think in the moment? It depends where you're at in an act, specifically in TV. And in a movie, it depends where you're at in your, like, 3-act structure is a typical movie. It's a lot of times they call it a 3-act structure. In TV, if you have 4 commercial breaks, it's a 5-act show. If you have 5 commercial breaks, it's a 6-act show. You know, it just depends how many commercials there are. But where you are in each act and then where that act is in placement of the show also tells you the intensity level of either the action or the emotion or just how much punch you want that cue to have.
So because it's funny because, you know, I talk about, sorry to cut you off, but I know you well enough. I can do that now. I'm always pushing people to understand developmental arcs and deliver cues that aren't linear and boring, but have stuff that builds, and you build mostly through adding and subtraction of instruments. You're talking about a story arc in TV. So this is a question. If you're an editor, you might pull from the first third of the cue, which tends to be a little more sparse, a little more low key, not as dynamic. For the next act and the subsequent acts, as they're getting more developed, maybe more action, they're just becoming more intense, you would probably, as an editor, pull from later in the cue when literally the volume is up, the number of instruments, the musical activity has become bigger, maybe more grandiose.
Yes, with a broad brush, that is exactly how you start. You know, and then of course you want to go in and you never want to stick to super strict rules because then you start to feel homogenized, right? Everything starts to feel the same. But yes, you want to have somewhere to go in your show, and hopefully your show builds and, you know, tension release, and hopefully over time, much like I guess the stock market or, you know, anything, or my weight, you know, over time, hopefully my weight starts going the other way. But, you know, over time, you started here and you want to end up here. How you get there, it's fine to take twists and turns, but you want to be cognizant of that. Otherwise, you have what sometimes they call wall-to-wall music, where everything is kind of like one level and it doesn't help the storytelling. Mm-hmm. And so I think good shows try to avoid that. Sometimes the networks, they want you to have wall-to-wall music because, like I said, really, some people do the laundry while they're watching your show. Like, it's that kind of show. They want it on in the background while they're doing other things in their lives. Whereas like an elevated Netflix documentary, someone's going to sit down and give you your full attention, usually, right? They're watching for different reasons. Am I watching to wind down at the end of a hard day? Do I really want to get into this project? And different shows serve different, know your client. Different shows serve different purposes. So your music in a Netflix show can maybe be more experimental. You can go with less music. You can go with no music. If you're doing one of those shows that people watch while doing their laundry, you're going to need a lot more music because it better sound exciting in the other room. So,
you know, it's funny. I've got another really good friend who is a music supervisor, and he always says that musicians need to remember that they're not in the music industry anymore when they're doing film and TV stuff, that they're in the film and TV industry. And it goes back to your Legos, you know, or a jigsaw puzzle. You're part of the bigger thing. But in a musician's mind, because creative people want to be proud of their work. They want to be patted on the back and admired for this great creative output. they think of the music, and that's all they can think of. But what you're describing today is like a tour de force education on how musicians really need to think about the bigger picture so that they make music that is more usable. That's one of my favorite terms. It's if you had to choose between somebody who is a creative musical genius as a composer or somebody who had a bunch of B plus and A minus stuff that was very usable, would you gravitate towards Mr. Usability or Mr. Genius?
Usability every time, because here's the thing. All of us, anybody who's creative, you have the instinct, because I do too. You want to be like, you want to make something that's so fresh and so different and so cool, and it's you, and it's your artistic stamp. Yeah. You can do that if you go pay for it yourself and you fund it and you do what you want to do. And that's kind of what we did with our movie Dying to Do Letterman, which nobody wanted, and we ended up getting a theatrical release, and it was one of the best things we ever did.
By the way, everybody should Google that and watch it. It's really heartwarming. It's very funny. And I'm not going to give away the ending and the post-log, I guess you would call it, epilogue.
Nah. It's a good movie for artists. It's a good movie for anybody with a dream.
And your wife, Joke, famously said to you, I remember you telling me this at dinner, and I think I saw it maybe in your bio again, or somewhere, or an interview that you guys did. Oh, I can pop up. Look at this, how high-tech I am. There they are. That was just last year. Anyway, Joke, how old were you guys when this shot was taken? Do you remember?
Shockingly, it wasn't that long ago, so I'll let you in on a little secret. I've actually basically been gray since I was 20 years old. They were dyeing my hair when I was on Keenan and Kel. During COVID, I gave up. I just stopped dyeing my hair. So I think this was maybe like 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
It actually wasn't that long ago. But yeah, it was Real Screen Magazine. We were very flattered. They did a story on our company, and they're sort of like a big trade magazine for the unscripted documentary industry. And obviously, my wife is my way better half. Clearly.
I love your wife, and I mean that obviously in the most respectful way. But, how often do you meet a person that you become friends with, like we did, and then you meet their spouse, and you love them both equally, and for different reasons.
You can say you love her more. It's okay, Michael.
No, it's just, it's almost like she and I have a rapport. She and I love talking politics, as does Biagio. The three of us are political animals. We love watching how the press butchers politics. So we'll talk about that endlessly.
Well, also just coming from a documentary perspective, having worked with CNN, it's really interesting to, for me, it's always interesting from the story point of view, because there's always as a storyteller, you get to understand that every news story at the end of the day, these days especially, is really a story, again, serving their audience. So, it's interesting, but I do love every aspect of stories told on TV, no matter the genre.
And the reason I just brought up Joke again was she told you, if I'm getting this right, please correct me if I'm wrong, in college when you guys met and you first both, talked about your love of production, she said to you, it's virtually impossible to get anything picked up today. You got to make it yourself, in so many words. You could probably clarify how she exactly said it.
No, she did. She said, I'm convinced the only way to make it is to produce your own projects. And I instantly fell in love with her. That was the third day of school. And I was like, oh, it's on. Oh, we're going. I don't want to diss anybody, but let's just say, coming from Cuyahoga Community College, I expected to love UCLA. And I have so much more fondness in my heart for Cuyahoga Community College.
Really?
I think, when you go to a community college, the people who teach you are part-time teachers and full-time professionals. The person who taught me camera work was the local news camera guy. The person teaching us theater ran the local theater. It was like they were all professionals. And at UCLA, they're professors. And it's sort of it's a different thing. But I met my wife, and then my dorm mate helped us get our first television show. So I got a wife and a career out of UCLA. So I can say nothing bad about the school. I mean, that's pretty good. But coming back to your artistic question and usability versus art, artistry. What I like the artisan. Is that how you would say it?
Artisan.
I like the craftsman. Yeah, artisan. I like the craftsman approach. Right? Is if you think to yourself when you're writing a cue for this end of the business, hey, how do I collaborate with them after the fact and give them everything they need so I can help them score their scenes, your cue is so much more useful. And that's what I need. If you write a brilliant jazz cue with a gazillion, concurrent lines on all these different instruments at once, it may be like an amazing thing to behold. Unless I'm cutting a very specific scene about some jazz genius, at a jazz bar, and I need that for background music, that thing ain't ever going in my show. So I pick usability every time, and that is not a knock.
No.
It is a skill to predict what I might need weeks, days, months, even years after you wrote a cue. Because I might use a cue that got published 30 years ago, but it's got the right stems, and guess what? You just helped me 30 years in the future. You put your cue in a time machine and gave me what I needed to build a scene around it in 2024. Thank you, first of all, for making my life easier. And why not? Put all your cues in a time machine. Do that. Put your cues in a time machine. Think about it that way. You're writing it now, and at some point in the future, that thing's going to get rearranged to perfection. And no one will ever recognize it as your cue, and that's a compliment to you because you gave us what we needed to make a good show. So pat yourself on the back and keep going. And it does not take that much extra time. I know because I do it.
We've got 15 minutes left, and one thing I don't want to leave out of the show is your experience on the Taxi Forum, which I won't even give that a lead in. You tell the whole story. I didn't know this as well as we've gotten to know each other, and we've known each other, 18 months, whatever it is. You've never shared that with me until late last night or early this morning.
Yeah, I was like, by the way, did you know this? Okay, so, by the way, this is why I giggle, when people are asked, like, well, what is Taxi all about? Do they really help people, get their music placed, blah, blah, blah. I don't need to tell you. You've heard the questions. You've answered them. So this is, I think, 2012 or 2013. The post is still there. And I'll say the name of the post. So we had done this really cool magic show with a friend of mine. His name's Andrew Main. Brilliant dude, magician. And it was a magical prank show. It was called Don't Trust Andrew Main.
Right.
And it was one of these where the pilot was, we were really stretching the budget because the magic was so expensive to produce. It was really good, but it was really expensive. And so I was literally cutting the show open myself, doing the graphics myself, and of course, picking all the music myself. And we knew we wanted to have like a more edgy feeling to the show. And it was for Annie, one of the libraries Annie worked with is, I can say Extreme Music, right? I mean, they're like, everybody knows them. They're not going to take your pitch because they're huge. Right. Like it's Hans Zimmer is there, they have the, Blue Saraceno, is that his name? He was like an 80s rock star. He writes songs over there. I mean, it's like, they're like the top of the top TV composers. So I'm there. And I find this awesome album of these like really cool swagger rock cues. I'm like, this is it. Love these cues. They're a little raw. They're rough around the edges, but they're exactly what I need. And I pulled all the cues from that, right? And I had every show started with our version of the try this at home because people would probably hurt themselves. So that was one guitar cue. Then I had the theme song for the show. That was another guitar cue. And then that album of cues I used all over the show in every episode. It was the perfect tone. I was like, this is great. Show airs, and then I was working on either the webpage for it or Andrew, I don't remember. For some reason, I had to Google the show. And this weird thing comes up at the top of Google, don't trust Andrew Main, but do trust Taxi. And I was like, did we do a Taxi magic trick I forgot about? I was like,
the disappearing cab.
Yeah, I'm like, did we make a car disappear? Because we had done some car, and I was like, what the? So I had a click, right? So I clicked. By the way, I had heard of Taxi before because even though at that point I hadn't officially started writing for our shows yet, but it was something I always tinkered with. So I knew what Taxi was, but I didn't make the connection.
Okay.
And I click over, and it's a guy who wrote the post, and he's like, I just wanted to share this success story with you. The show is aired, so I can say, but like, I'm really excited because my cue got picked. It's in every episode for the, don't try this at home section. And another Taxi member, I don't want to, I don't want to call him out because he hasn't said publicly. His cue got picked for the theme song. And I'm like, I picked it. That was me. Your music's I was so excited. I almost wanted to comment, but I didn't because then I felt like they're going to be like, who's this weird producer butting in and being like, yeah, I'm the one who gave you your big break. I didn't want it to come across like that. So I didn't say anything, but I was so tickled because I was like, wow, like those dudes, like your music is in my show because you applied to one of these taxi briefs. You ended up at Extreme Music, which they are like, I mean, listen, they're one of the premier. Like, no new musician is going to just get in there by accident. You pretty much have to be invited, you know, and there they are talking about their placement. So over the years, I would just always kind of giggle when people would be like, well, nothing happened for me with Taxi. I don't, you know, whatever they say, whatever the thing is. I get it. Nothing's going to work for everybody, but clearly my first connection from this world to your world all those years ago was that web result. And it just always made me so happy, because I remember the late night, I'm editing the graphics, I'm really tired, I'm trying to find something. I had tried like orchestral, I had tried a dramedy cue, I had tried some action type stuff that was kind of edgy, and I'm just like, I'm just gonna go guitar. I'm just gonna just try. And I found these swagger cues every episode. They were in every episode, and a whole bunch of them came from Taxi. So that was, you know, that was really cool. And whoever's watched, I don't know if those people are still around, but if you see that post, it was my great honor to find your cue and use it in that show. And thank you for saving me at 3 a.m. on a really lonely night when I was in the dark edit bay and I just wanted to go home to my wife. Your cue made it. It stayed in, and those cues were all over the series.
That's such a great story. I love it. What makes a cue unusable? You've probably touched on that in the context of you know what? Let's move on, because you've talked about things that don't work. But if you love a cue, but maybe you don't think the horns sound like A+ horns. Maybe it's a bad sample library they use. Maybe they didn't execute the articulations well. For whatever reason, the cue matches the beat of the scene. It's got the tone. It's got everything you need, but it's got something a little wrong with an instrument sound. Would you pass on the cue because of that thing, or would you look at the bigger picture and go, well, it elevates my scene. Nobody at home is ever going to hear the horns. The French horns don't sound wonderful.
Yeah. So have I used cues like that where that was an issue? Yes. And there's a couple of different things that come into play. One, it depends on the scene, because if it's a scene where the dialogue is so front and center, and I know it's going to be mixed down, and I realize that this is my personal taste versus something no one else is going to care about, including my wife, I'll let it go. What happens more often than not, and this is where cue survivability comes in, is I really like the cue. I'm not crazy about that sound. Do I have the stems? Is there a stem without it? If there's not a stem without it, how hard is it for me to rebuild the entire cue with 6 stems minus the stem that has it? And I've done that before. I'll just rebuild the entire cue because it's right. I like it. It takes an extra 10 minutes, but I think it works for the scene. Again, I think like if you're going to do a really cool cue and you make a very specific decision, like I'm going to throw a theremin in here because why not? That's sort of like woo, that crazy little Halloween soundy thing, right? And I really like the cue. I really hope you gave me a version without the theremin if I'm not doing a Halloween kind of thing,
Yeah.
Or so yes, I will not get completely turned off from a cue because of one sound or one suboptimal sound. A lot of times, honestly, I don't even care if it's a bad mix. There are plenty of cues I've heard where I'm like, yeah, this mix isn't the best. No one's ever going to hear it. We're mixing the whole show. Dialogue's front and center. Now, if it's going to be a, front and center and it's like over a montage or it's like a transitional cue and it's really important, that's a different story. So the answer is it depends, but I have kept plenty of cues where there was one part that irked me. Couple of different solutions are, is that in the entire cue? Because if it's not, right, I'll just re-edit the cue to the part where it's not. Do I have the stem without it? Great. Can I live with it? Great. If not, well, it's out. So give me the stem so you don't have that problem.
And I completely agree with you. And our members are probably watching this going, well, then why did a taxi screener not forward something that had a bad French horn sound in it? And the reason is because the way libraries judge music and the way Biagio is judging music in that scenario he just explained, a library wants something that's never going to be met with resistance. First of all, they have an image to keep up. Quality, quality, quality. So they get a happy camper like Biagio. Second of all, it's survivability and saleability, all those things. So they won't accept something that is a B plus French horn sound. And if something like that does make it into a library in the context of an editor looking at the bigger picture, they can either edit out that section or they can use the stems to create a mix without it. So that's great information.
You're 100% right. Because a music library, we expect them to be high quality. And so, yes, don't ever get mad if your cue gets rejected for having a lousy sound. Do a better job on your sounds. Just if somehow I end up with it, that's a different story because it's a different context.
So you've done both a lot of documentary work and a lot of unscripted television. Do you have a conscious thought, or have you done enough of both now that you don't really have to think about it? But your approach for music, when you sit down to create a show, because you are a creator, you'll have an idea, you'll write a treatment, you'll pitch it to a network, you'll get funded to go do a pilot. Is your thought process about where you want to go musically, does it enter your mind early in the game, number one? And number two, is it a different thought process for unscripted TV versus documentary?
Yes, and 100%. And I can give you a couple examples if we have time.
Yeah, we've got 3.5 minutes. We're good.
Oh boy, I better talk fast. Okay.
we can run a few over.
We were lucky enough to do a few, even though they weren't true theatrical documentaries, much more doc feeling shows for MTV Docs back in the day. We did a True Life, and we did this documentary series, one of the best things we ever made, called Caged. I love that show. Oh my God, I almost tear up talking about it to this day. So Caged was this amazing show where this small town in Minden, Louisiana, it was Minden, Louisiana, and the sport that had taken over, had surpassed football, became the thing everybody came out for, was cage fighting. And it was all these young boys and girls, young men, teenagers, striving to fight their way out of this town all the way to the UFC. And some of them had already made it. Wow. Like there were 2 hometown heroes who had done it. So it was really interesting because you start there and you go, okay, we're dealing with, themes of identity, themes of, courage and getting in this ring to chase your dreams. We're dealing with these deep moments of self-reflection and like, oh my God, I'm putting my body and my well-being on the line, because I believe in this dream and I'm good at it, and I train for it. It's not a haphazard fight. It's an art. It's as much an art as a, so we want to capture all of that. And one of the shows that we really liked as a launch pad to think about music in a more cinematic way, because it's MTV Docs and we could do this. We couldn't do this if we were doing a typical cable show. Well, because it's MTV Docs, we're like, let's talk in terms of scripted. And we love the show Friday Night Lights. One of my wife, wow, look at me, I'm tearing up. I am such a dork. One of my wife's and my favorite shows.
I love the show as well.
Yeah, so I really wanted to musically capture, a lot of the feeling that was in that show. Now we could never, first of all, you don't want to do a straight ripoff, of course. Right. And, but they had those wonderful sweeping, single guitar notes and those wide expanses. And a lot of the way the music worked was to support the same kind of themes we had on our show, but it's still MTV. We still have to think about, yes, it's a doc. Yes, it's for MTV, but we still have, it's not a Friday Night Lights audience, and it's not a pure doc audience. Luckily, we had a budget, so it's like, okay, how do we start with that? And then we also had money to get Rihanna, and we had, Donald Glover. I can't think. Was it Young Gambino, Childish Gambino?
Right.
And we had Flo Rida. So we had money to get all these pop acts, and so it's like, okay, now how do we build a tapestry that helps us get between these moments, have these reflection moments, where we can pull back for a second, get inside this kid's head who's literally fighting on the 1-year anniversary of his girlfriend's tragic death, coming off a loss, and all he wants to do is win this fight because he wants redemption for him and his town, and the whole family is there, and there's so much pressure for him to win. And how do we go into that moment and be able to have that, but then also snap out and keep our audience? And so it became this whole, like, how do we weave these 2 different music styles together and build our palette from that, right? And we could do that a little bit more with doc. Now, if I was doing a feature-length documentary, the sky's the limit, especially if I'm funding it myself. We can sit back and be like, what experimental things do we want to try? Let's get crazy. Let's throw everything at it, because who cares? We're paying for it. I'm the client. I do what I want. If we're doing a table show, it's like, okay, how do we get away with a few experimental things? Operation Undercover being a good example, where we built all these cues out of, sound that we ripped right out of the field audio, so we could do cues that were at the very least were ours, maybe at the best had some subliminal connection to the show, but worked within the framework we need to be an access to action show and investigation discovery. So those thoughts are the first things. And when I pitch, like when we were pitching Unmasking a Killer, which ended up getting picked up by CNN for CNN and HLN, I pitched the soundboard. I said, like, these are our sort of sweeping thoughts for how musically we want to represent, the idea that this killer is still out there. And this is how much we want to use music. And this is when we don't want to use music. And this is how we want to steer the show, and then I would actually present playlists to them of cues. And I'd be like, this is what I'm thinking. I know it's a little outside the norm. What do you think? Sometimes they say yay. Sometimes they say nay, but that's how you do something that maybe
that
is
unusual,
a little more bespoke.
to pitch them using a soundboard, to be talking about music in a pitch. That would, to me, seem a rare occurrence.
Maybe, and maybe it was because of my experience with MTV, where you can imagine music was so important.
Right.
And so that MTV Docs experience, maybe that's why I do that now. Maybe a lot of other production companies don't. I would think in some sense music gets talked about on every show, but the specific soundboard, and I don't necessarily do that for every show, because there's some execs who I know they're like, don't bother me with that. Just make it sound like our shows. So again, it depends on the situation. But I will do that for an elevated doc, like for an elevated doc series, and not only music. I pitch, how will sound design support story? I had an executive once ask me how the music would support the emotional velocity of the scene. I'm not even sure I knew what that meant, but I BS'd my way through it as best I could. So, you just roll with it, and somewhere, coming out in the wash, hopefully, is something that's a little bit more bespoke and just a little bit more unique than every other show they're putting on the air that month.
Well,
and
I'm so blown away. I mean, every time we go out to dinner, they're usually like 3-hour dinners, sometimes even longer. I get in the car on the way home and I just think, wow, that was the best time. It's like I want to go home and hang out more with you guys. It's like, okay, go home, put the kids to bed. Let's hang out in the living room and keep the conversation rolling. But this has been great. I'm so happy that you agreed to do this, because our members really think in terms of only music, because that's their life. That's their raison d'etre. And it's really good for them to have this inside baseball view of how all those puzzle pieces come together and where their music fits in, and how the deciders, of which you are one on several different levels, many different levels, look at their music. So one last question I want to ask you before we wrap this up is, knowing now what you know about music for television, I guess leaning towards unscripted, forget that part of it. What advice would you have for somebody who has made the decision, I keep hearing about this sync thing and music licensing. I'm going to jump in both feet first on January 2nd, as soon as my hangover goes away. And I'm going to go after a career in sync music. What advice would you give to somebody who's brand new at all of this?
I'm going to steal this advice from a piece of advice I read in a book when I was learning how to build websites.
Okay.
But it's 100% applicable, and it's easy to remember. Forget cool, think useful. That's it. Forget cool, think useful. And I think that gets you out of that space of trying to be too artistic and into the space of, how do I collaborate with you after the fact? And if you approach your cue like a toolkit, which is not hard, I promise, you've already done it. It's mixed in your DAW. You've already got it grouped. If you just take the extra few minutes to export those stems and think, how could they rearrange this if they wanted to? It's not hard. I just need the stems. Your usefulness will go through the roof. Save the really cool, fantastic, artsy stuff for your albums. Save it for the stuff you go out and do personally. You want to work in this business? Just make it easy for me. All I want to do is use your music and keep it in when I get notes from the network. So be one of the 50% of the cues that has the cue survivability and last. Forget cool, think useful. And I think that was from a book called Websites That Suck. But it was an old book, but it was something like that. But I really think if you want an easy way, forget cool, think useful. And you're so much better.
Incredibly good advice. You know, a lot of times when we're hanging out at restaurants and even today during the show, I'm thinking, God, you and I could do a great book together. And then I think, who the hell has the time? It's amazing. I would say we probably average a dinner every couple of months. And we book them anywhere between 2 and 4 weeks in advance because we're both really busy. I wish we weren't, because I wish we could spend more time together. But I'm really grateful that you took the time today in the middle of a work day to pre-tape this Taxi TV so that our members can learn stuff from you. I don't even think a lot of this stuff has ever been covered at the Road Rally other than when you did your presentation in 2023. So thank you so much. And please give my love to Joke. I hope you and Joke and the kids have a great Christmas, and that 2025 is a year that we look back on 5 years from now and go, that was a great year.
Heck yeah. Boy, same back at you, Michael. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody who took the time to watch. I hope I didn't sound too loud and annoying. I was trying to project into this mic, but thank you. And it was an honor to be here after I've watched so many, and my kids have watched so many of these over the years. They're going to get to see this one, I promise. So,
hi, kids. Sending you love from Taxi World headquarters. Thanks, Biagio. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Talk soon. Thank you.